Unfortunately, NIST changed its mind on this with its final report. NIST did a reversal, and they said that no studs were installed on the girders. This point is very important to NIST theory. Unfortunately for NIST, it was not just its own 2004 interim report that contradicted this vital aspect of the final theory. The presence of shear studs on that critical girder was also described by John Salvarinas, who was the project manager for Building 7 from the company that supplied the steel components. Salvarinas wrote an academic paper about Building 7 in 1986, describing the construction in detail. NIST referred to that paper, as I show here, in its interim report, but did not mention it in its final report. That may be because this diagram from Salvarinas' paper shows where the author indicated the presence of 30 shear studs on that critical girder. But how could thermal expansion cause the breakage of what would be 28 shear studs on each of the 5 floor beams, 30 shear studs on the critical girder, and 4 bolts connecting the girder to column 79? The mechanism NIST proposed is called differential thermal expansion. This is where the expansion of the beam is much greater than the expansion of the floor above it, and it causes shear stress. The expansion actually moves in both directions, but NIST said the external wall was strong enough to withstand it, so all of that expansion moved towards the critical girder. Because thermal expansion is a function of temperature, again, we need to take a look, as we did with Cardington test results, to see if it's a new phenomenon, as NIST suggests. But you can see that it's actually been a consideration throughout history, as these 2 building professionals from Australia pointed out when they wrote a response to NIST on the Building 7 report. These building professionals reported that they had actually done physical tests to see what thermal expansion would do to floor assemblies that were bolted to floor beams and girders. These were just the kinds of tests that NIST should have done. Because they had actually done the test, the Australians were able to state that what NIST proposed was not their experience at all, and that they did not agree with it. The shear studs would not fail because the floor slab was heated as well, and since the concrete in the floor slab has an expansion coefficient that's very nearly the same as steel, the entire composite would expand together. So NIST's final theory is at odds with actual experimental evidence from the testing of real floor assemblies. Another thing we have to take a look at is just how far that girder would have had to be pushed for it to walk off its seat, as NIST suggests. NIST reported that the seat at column 79 was 11 inches wide. The structural diagrams actually say the seat was 12 inches wide, but we won't bicker on that because you'll soon see that it doesn't matter. If we assume that the seat was 11 inches wide, NIST says the girder had to be pushed at least 5.5 inches, or half of that distance, to walk off the seat. And the reason they say that is that they need what's called the web, or the vertical section in the middle of the beam, to actually push all the way to the edge so that most of the mass of the girder would fall. The majority of the mass would fall. So half the distance has to be reached. Let's take a look at what temperature NIST says the beams reach so that we can estimate how much they expanded. This was a tricky question for NIST, and we can see throughout its report on Building 7 that NIST struggled with this answer. It was tricky because at temperatures as high as 600 degrees Celsius, which NIST says the floor beams reached on the south and east areas of floor 12, the steel will lose strength and stiffness and therefore not be able to extend and push into the girder. At the same time, if the temperature is not high enough, there won't be enough expansion of the beams. What NIST settled on was the idea that just on the northeast corner of floor 12, the beam temperatures only reached 400 degrees Celsius. Apparently, NIST investigators felt that with this distribution of temperatures in their computer models, they could show that the critical beams on the northeast side would remain rigid, whereas all the other floor beams on the south and east areas of floor 12 would be hot enough. Actually, floor 13, the ceiling of floor 12, would be hot enough so that when the girder on the northeast fell off, the floors would be ready to collapse in unison. Again, it's hard to believe that anybody could have ever predicted any of this. But on this slide, you can see another example of just how tenuous NIST computer models were with respect to reality. NIST computer model had the steel reaching extreme temperatures and all the bolts and other connections failing within a matter of about 2 seconds. This is an example of how NIST computer modeling was not realistic. Once the temperature distribution needed for the theory was settled, NIST found a way to suggest that the differential thermal expansion could be possible, at least in the computer. They simply didn't heat the floor slab. You can see here that despite NIST's claim in several parts of its report that the beams on the northeast corner reached a temperature of only 400 degrees, in the computer model, the beams on the northeast corner were heated to 600 degrees. More importantly, the floor slabs were left unheated. So if you heat the floor beams to an extreme temperature and leave the slab unheated, there will be differential thermal expansion, but only in the computer. This is what most scientists would call fraud. But NIST theory has more problems than that. Given NIST temperature scenario, the amount of expansion by the beams would not satisfy the amount of expansion that NIST said was required. NIST provided an example of the equation that scientists use to calculate thermal expansion. This equation requires only the length of the object, the coefficient of expansion for that material, and the change in temperature. NIST's example here uses the girder length of 45 feet, and they used 600 degrees Celsius in this example, but neither of these values are applicable to the initiating event. If we put the right values in the equation, including the length of the beam, which was 53 feet, the change in temperature for the beams, not the temperature they reached, but the change on the northeast corner from room temperature to 400 degrees, we see that the maximum expansion would be 3.3 inches. That's all it can do. And the 3.3 inches would not be enough to cause the girder to walk off its seat. Therefore, NIST theory is not only disproven by the actual physical tests performed by the Australians, it's disproven in theory as well. Despite the fact that we have already seen that NIST theory is unrealistic, we should look further to get a better picture of how NIST was able to convince people that it was realistic. One thing NIST said was that there were 7-hour fires in Building 7, which gave the impression that the fires were very long and very hot. It seems odd, on a side note, that NIST computer simulation covered a time period beyond the actual collapse of the building, going to 6 p.m. In any case, photographs show that fires were known to exist on some floors as early as just after noon. Those early photographs did not show fires on the floors of interest, which are now floors 11 through 13, until after 2 p.m. So the evidence shows, the first evidence shows, fires on those floors after 2 p.m. How the fires in Building 7 started is even a mystery. Some buildings that were damaged by falling debris did not have fires. For example, the Deutsche Bank building, some people may know, was severely damaged over a long stretch of the building, but did not have any fires. NIST suggested 2 scenarios for starting the fires in Building 7, so they actually haven't settled on one of these. The first was that falling debris from the North Tower started the fires in some unexplained impact manner. Due to the design of the building, fires could not be spread from floor to floor, so the scenario would require that at least 10 separate fires, because we saw fires on 10 floors, were started separately through the impact damage.